want to thank my colleagues, former colleagues, forever friends, for being here today. I guess if I had to pick moments in Court of Appeals history, I'd put this one on the map and on the chart. The Court of Appeals began in the year 1847, but it lumbered along for 136 years before a single woman came on the court, and here we are, 5 of us. What a great day and what a wonderful celebration this is. My road to the Court of Appeals actually begins with a dirt road in a little community up in Sullivan County, Maplewood, New York. My parents were immigrants to this country, farmers, and I have vivid memories of those first years on the farm, maybe most especially being driven by my father down the hill to a one-room schoolhouse, which I attended in kindergarten. We then moved into the Big Apple, which was Monticello, New York, where my parents had a store, and that's basically where I grew up. My parents were firm believers in education. They wanted me to be a school teacher fervently, to go to college and live in Monticello or somewhere nearby. I cannot imagine what drove me to New York City. And so I think probably a combination of perverseness and perseverance.
I was born in New York City. I grew up in Washington Heights. I attended both parochial and public schools. I went to Hunter College, and then I went to St. John's University School of Law. I was a teacher. I taught social studies during the day, and at night attended law school. I had been inspired by a political science professor at Hunter College.
I live in the town of Guilderland in Albany County in New York, but I was born in Rockville Center. My parents lived in Elmont, as did both of my sets of grandparents. I was very fortunate. I had a very close-knit Italian-American family. 2 of my grandparents came to this country as teenagers with virtually nothing. My other set of grandparents were born here, but they were from large Italian families. So my grandparents had next to no formal education. One of my grandmothers never did speak English. So education became a very important factor for my parents. They were not able to attend college. The family did not have the economic resources for that. They were very hardworking, but one thing they always instilled in us was that they wanted us to do well in school, and they wanted to provide more for us than what they had been able to achieve. And so I felt that as a child, the importance of that.
I was born in a very small town on the Ohio River in southeastern Ohio, smack dab in the middle of Appalachia. As a child, I really, really loved music. I studied classical ballet, I studied classical music, I played the piano, I studied voice, because even in the small town of Gallipolis, Ohio, we had a piano teacher who graduated from Juilliard, and I had a ballet teacher who had danced in New York. She filled my head with tales of George Balanchine, but when I reached the age of 13, I realized I would never achieve my life's ambition, which was to dance for George Balanchine in the New York City Ballet. And for some reason at that point I decided I would become a lawyer. I'm not entirely sure why. Probably had something to do with my dad. My dad was a small businessman, and he also was very active in Ohio politics. My family, my dad's family, had lived in that part of the United States forever, really since the earliest years of the Republic.
I was born and raised on the Lower East Side, born in 1960, and so I'm a child of the early part of the 60s in that way, raised by my mother, mostly in the tenements, and then we moved to the Baruch houses on the Lower East Side, so a very dynamic and exciting neighborhood, all different kinds of people, an immigrant population and a migrant population. I'm Puerto Rican, and it was just a great place to grow up.
legal practice was strengthened, enriched by Bar Association activity, pro bono activity. I was on the board of the Legal Aid Society. I even took some pro bono cases. Thought about it a lot, about those years, and whether I felt different as a woman in the world of major litigation. I mean, I was in major law firms that had major matters, so did I receive exactly the same treatment as my male colleagues? I think not. I think there was a growing awareness that the world had more than white males who deserved to be recognized, and that, especially in the justice system, that justice encompassed a wider group, both the appearance of justice and the fact of justice, and that included women and diversity of all sorts, and suddenly the idea began dawning. He took a big risk when he appointed me, because the traditional role to the Court of Appeals was through prior judicial service, and the traditional gender of the Court of Appeals was male. From 1847 to 1983, there was no woman on the Court of Appeals. So Mario Cuomo, I think, took a very, very big risk when he appointed somebody who was not only female, but also had never previously served as a judge.
I was the first Hispanic woman. There were many men. I was the first Hispanic woman appointed to a court of record in the States.
And the first Hispanic woman on the Court of Appeals?
The first Hispanic, period.
Hispanic.
Unless you count Judge Cardozo. My arrival at the court was heralded by snow, an Albany snowstorm in January. I finally reached the courthouse after missing the exit several times, and was welcomed by Judge Kaye, a warm smile, a warm embrace, and a bottle of bubbly champagne. I did feel some discrimination in the courthouse, but it was mostly gender-based, and there were situations, for example, I remember one situation where I appeared before a judge, and I placed my appearance on the court, and the appearance was Edward Q. Carr, Attorney-in-Chief, Carmen Beauchamp of Counsel, and he looked down at me and he said, "Are you Edward Q. Carr?" And I said, "No, he's the Attorney-in-Chief. I'm of counsel." And he said, "Oh, well, you must be one of the Indians then." And he said, "But you must be an Indian princess." So every time I walked into his courtroom, he called me princess. He never learned my name. However, I obviously I got his attention, because I'd walk into his courtroom with my cases and he'd say, "Oh, princess, come up here." And then he's, "What cases are on today?" And then he'd call my cases. So it did not at that time work to my disadvantage. However, I realized later, much later, that that was sexism.
I think one of the most shining moments for me was when Judge Kaye's portrait went up in the courtroom, because since I trained as a teacher, I do go in and I speak to a lot of the young school children that come in when they're bringing classes. I'll get phone calls from our public relations officer, and he'll tell me a school is coming, and I always go over and talk to the kids. And there's always a couple of little whippersnappers. There's always some little girls in the 4th or 5th grade that will say, "All these portraits are men." And it was so great the first time that I was in there with a school group, and I said, "What do you notice about the portraits in the room?" And one little girl said, "There's a woman with a red blouse on." And I thought that was terrific. That, to me, just showed that it's there's opportunity, and that's a symbol of opportunity. And we need to make that opportunity available to everyone.
When I came on the court, there were already 3 women in the court, so it was interesting. We made a female majority, and boy, did we have fun teasing our male colleagues about that. We have knockdown, drag-out fights sometimes around the conference table, but then we kiss and make up, and we go on to the next battle. And you never know the person who's on the other side of a case that you're discussing at the conference table one day, may give you the fourth vote the next time. So you want to make sure that you do stay collegial and don't burn those bridges.
Having seen certainly Justice Sotomayor and other women in the court system, other people of color in the court system, it certainly inspired me to see that could be something that I would be able to aspire to and to achieve. When the opportunity arose to apply to the Court of Appeals, I looked carefully at who had been on the court, and I realized that certainly Judge Ciparick, but other members of the court had public interest backgrounds, service backgrounds, and that had not been an obstacle to their being selected and appointed. And so I rethought the way I had approached my own interest and ability to sit on the court. The fact that more women are in law school, we're closer to parity, we're closer to that 50-50 in law school, that more women then will enter the legal profession will indeed transform the profession in ways that I don't think we can envision at this point in time. Certainly the number of people of color and women of color who enter that workplace will also transform, as is true of every other group that has gone before. You transform the workplace, and I think what we have seen is that has been very positive. That's not a negative transformation, that we're talking about ways that we grow and learn, and that our workplace becomes better as a result.
So I'll just going backward. I'll start for a moment with my career as a lawyer and take you all the way back, like to the 70s, the 1970s. I was a litigator, and I remember being on a case where we started the suit in Delaware by attaching the stock of the defendant, which very shortly thereafter got found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The case got dismissed in Delaware, got moved to Florida, and I along with it. I had 3 young children I could manage fine in Delaware. Going back and forth to Florida was much more of a challenge. Finally, I submitted a letter of resignation to my law firm, seeing no alternative. And that awakened all the male people at the firm. We had, I was the only woman at the firm, and they said, "Why didn't you say something? We didn't realize." And that became a lifetime lesson for me. Speak up, speak up.
I too had a family and a young child. I remember when I first went on the bench, I was 36 when I went on the criminal court, and my daughter at the time was 3. And my husband Joe said to Roseanne, "Mommy's going to be a judge," and her response was, "Nah, judges are men." So that was a challenge. I would say that some of the biggest challenges, however, were these screening panels. I found them intrusive and certainly unwanted scrutiny, but I prevailed. But that was a big challenge and a difficult challenge, I felt.
I think we faced those kind of stereotypes, and people wanted to know who we were and what we were doing there. So you really had to be extremely well prepared and prove yourself over and over again.
There were some things early in my career, but I must say that it takes more support, takes really strong family support, but things are so different now than they were 20, 30 years ago.
So Judge Rivera, just picking up on that comment on things being so different today, what did you find, what would you call as a particular challenge, either in your career leading up to the Court of Appeals or in the process of becoming a judge?
In terms of the court, I agree that there's that challenge of, for me, entering, since I didn't have the judicial experience, entering a process with which I was completely unfamiliar, even trying to practice, preparing for each of those interviews, that would be the first time I would be in the actual interview. It's not like I had run that or done that before. I think the best piece of advice was always be yourself. And I think that's true. And I think that is and was a challenge when I started my career of making sure that I was being true to myself throughout, despite the external pressures.
And maybe over the decades, that's what we've all discovered, the importance of being ourselves, and we feel fortunate that we are able to be ourselves. I want to move from this sort of dismal subject of challenges to bright spots and standouts, absolute standouts. And I already volunteered one, which is this opportunity, the 5 of us. And so I have to put very high on my list the arrival of Judge Ciparick, the arrival of Judge Graffeo, the arrival of Judge Read, the arrival of Judge Rivera. And I'll stop at those 2 at the moment and ask each of you might volunteer a standout, a Court of Appeals standout for you.
When I look around at all of the portraits on the wall, and I think of what a great legacy we have in the Court of Appeals, it's such an honor and a responsibility to be a part of that.
Judge
Well, I
Ciparick?
totally agree. And you're tearing.
Yeah.
You're tearing.
We all are.
We all are tearing. And I especially miss the court now and appreciate what you're saying. There were a lot of stand-up moments. There were some very difficult moments, some very tense moments, some very personally tragic moments. I remember sitting on the bench when I got the call that my father had died. I remember the illness of your husband and of my husband and the support that we each gave each other during those periods of time.
Judge Graffeo?
I don't know if you remember this, Judith, but in one of the early years when I was on the bench, sometimes things all of a sudden strike you that there's been a drastic change. If you recall, we had one argument and all the attorneys at the table were female. Mm-hmm. And I wrote a little note and passed it to you that, did you ever think you'd see the day when all the attorneys would be women and there'd be 4 of us sitting on the bench? And it just seemed like a special moment that day.
Absolutely.
For progress.
For me, it was the moment that I put on the robe to go in, and it's interesting. You mentioned the dress and the apparel and all that. There's so much tied up into the robe. One is no one knows what you're wearing underneath, and you might see something, but it's sort of the uniformity of it that kind of keeps you all at that same place. And of course, I want to say for the record, coming into chambers at the courthouse and finding this beautiful bouquet of flowers on my desk that Vicki had left for me was very, very special to me. And I thought, how wonderful to be in a place where being given flowers is not seen as anything other than a wonderful gesture of welcoming.
Well, I think you already know, even from your short time, and we definitely know, that there is no place like the Court of Appeals of the state of New York. I refer to it as lawyer heaven, but I think it's not duplicatable. And the feeling among us, I hope will project itself to the audience, because we really do have a very deep sense of caring for one another. There are 2 cases in the case books of the New York Court of Appeals where the 3 women then on the court, where the women or the 4, where they voted together. And I just wonder if any of you would care to comment.
Fred the Bull.
Fred the Bull.
Fred the Bull, a product, yes, a fellow who was attacked. Vicious propensity. So that's one case where we split by gender, right?
That's correct.
And the second
was a commercial case.
Yes.
A commercial case,
Fees on fees.
and I wrote the dissent. So anybody have a comment?
Not 2 categories of cases that most people would think that there would be.
Women's issues.
Women's issues,
Maybe
right.
Fred the Bull.
Which goes to show that it's the legal issues. It's
Right.
not the gender that
Right.
decides
Right.
the cases.
Is there some message that we would like to communicate, not just to the women, but to the audience in general, about the court about our own lives. Is there something we would like to tell the audience?
Well, let me start. I always say to young lawyers that my career, I've tried to follow the advice of Yogi Berra. When you come to a fork in the road, take it. So I started out at the State University, then I moved to a corporation where I worked for different businesses, and then I moved to private practice, and then I moved to the executive, and then I moved to the judiciary. So at each step, at each fork of the road, I had to master new areas in the law. I was exposed to whole new worlds, really. And I took some risks in doing that. So I always say to young attorneys, if you can do that, whenever an opportunity to do something different in the law comes your way, take it. Because down the road, you don't know where you're going to end up. I certainly didn't do any of those things or didn't make any of those moves with the thought I'd end up on the Court of Appeals. But I must say that at every step along the way, what I learned benefited me, and I think has made me a better judge as a result.
Well, you've mentioned Yogi Berra, so I have to just say a word about my favorite sport, and that is ice hockey.
Right.
I think Yogi Berra's words were prophetic and fine, but I prefer Wayne Gretzky,
Okay.
which is always skate to where the puck is going to be. I think that is good advice.
Well, I think we've been so fortunate at the Court of Appeals because the level of practice that we see in front of our courts is so fantastic. The lawyers are so well prepared. The cases are interesting. What I try to tell young attorneys and law students when I speak to them is the importance of developing that kind of reputation for high quality work, for conscientiousness, because it's surprising in the career, like Susan's, I've worked in many different employment situations, but it's surprising how years later your life intersects with people again. So they always remember what you did, what kind of a co-worker you were. So I think that it's such a message to our bar to act as mentors and to explain the importance of integrity and high ethical standards because it makes a real difference.
Well, I don't have a sports metaphor, but I totally agree, concur with everything that's been said around the table. Time goes by very quickly. My 19 years at the Court of Appeals went by very quickly. My close to 35 years on the bench went by very quickly. I think it's important to take advantage of what you have, to enjoy yourself, to work hard, to appreciate every day. Every day is a gift and should be appreciated and cherished, and to work hard and study hard and prepare and be the best that you can be, and that's my message.
I would say the one lesson that I learned over time was be a risk taker, that you have to be willing to do something that others are saying, that's not meant for you, that's not made for you. Why should you be the person? You don't have that background. That I think you have to be willing to take risks, work outside your comfort zone, because you don't know where it might lead. Where would we be today if our Judge Kaye, someone had told her, women don't go on the bench, or your daughter prevailed and said women are not judges, we wouldn't be here today. So I think you have to be willing to do things that in the moment appear to be untraditional, outside the norm, but over time we know we're exactly just right.
Well, I'll come back full circle. That's a mountaintop on which we'll end, and I'll simply say, I affirm, absolutely. And thank you all again. This was great.